Welcome, everybody. Thank you. Welcome to Gazzelli Art House. Thank you all so much for coming along to this talk. And we are going to be delving into the world of Lilly Fenichel. We'll be joined by several esteemed panelists. And afterwards, we'll have a Q&A after the talk. But before we begin, we've got a very special guest, Charles. I was wondering if you could come up and say a few words and introduce yourself and your role here.
Well, thank you very much, George, and thanks to the Gazzelli Gallery and to our panelists. My name is Charles Martin, and I am Lilly Fenichel's nephew or cousin or something like that, because she was my father's first cousin, and I knew her very well, and I used to go and stay with her in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where she lived. Today would have been, by weird coincidence, her 98th birthday. And you might think that she would be up there or down there, smiling at us here, gathered to some extent in her honor. In fact, she's almost certainly, wherever she is, scowling, because she was not a lover of the art world. And one of the reasons why she, along with many female AbEx artists, failed to receive the recognition that she might have deserved, you'll have your own views, but I think the quality of what we see around us speaks for itself. The reason that she didn't receive that recognition in her lifetime had a great deal to do with her antagonistic, frankly, relationship with the established art world. So she's up there scowling, but hopefully this evening we'll be smiling. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you again, George.
Hello, lovely to meet you all. My name's Francesca Gavin. I'll be moderating the conversation. I have an unusual relationship to this, which is my parents, including my mum over there, were very, very good friends of Lilly, and I actually grew up with one of her paintings my entire life, so I've always known her name, and stylistically it's incredibly different from everything else in this exhibition, but I'm a curator and a writer, the editor-in-chief of Epoch, and have written a lot of books and curated shows, etc. I'm going to get the rest of my panel to introduce themselves. So yes, I think they've got a microphone. You've all got microphones, so you should be
I
audio.
do, yeah.
Yes.
I'm not sure if it actually works, but
Yes,
I
think so.
I can reach the
We're
back of the
doing
room.
fine. Great.
Hi everyone, I am Laura Smith. I am Director of Collection and Exhibitions at the Hepworth Wakefield in Yorkshire, and was previously at Whitechapel Gallery, where I curated with Candy Stobbs, who's in the audience, Action Gesture Paint, Women Artists and Global Abstraction, 1940 to 1970, the world's longest title, which I think was the first UK show to include Lilly. We had two of her paintings that were really beautiful, and it was a show that looked at abstract expressionism as a genre across the world, but looking at women artists in particularly from those dates, 40 to 70.
I'm Christian Levitt. I've been collecting art for 30 years. And in the last 10 or 12 years, I've mostly focused on collecting modern art. And in the last 6 or 7 years, mostly artworks, almost entirely artworks by female artists. One of the widest parts of the collection is abstract expressionism, which actually I published a book on, which is available over there on the right, which is a sort of history of abstract expressionism from the female artist's perspective, 1940s to 1960s, using artworks from my collection. Lilly Fenichel, work by her, was a key purchase in the collection around 5 years ago. And yeah, I loaned a number of works to the Whitechapel show in 2023 that then went to the Fondation Van Goghian Art afterwards, and then to the Kunsthalle Bielefeld in Germany afterwards. So they were on tour for a year, so the Fenichel painting toured for a year. And then part of my abstract expressionist collection tours America from August this year for 2.5 years, goes to 5 different US museums. and the Lilly Fenichel painting will also be on that tour. So that one painting alone will have been in 8 different museum exhibitions in what will over time be about a 5 or 6 year period, and it's a key painting, a 1951 picture. So yeah, she's shown alongside Joe Mitchell, Helen Frankenthaler, Lee Krasner, Elaine de Kooning, Grace Hartigan, some of the bigger names in these exhibitions, the more names that you sort of might recognize. And so I also have a museum of artworks by female artist Femme in Mougins in the south of France near Cannes. So if you're in the south of France, come to Femme.
Very nice offer.
Yeah.
And yes, if you just...
I'm George, and I work at Gazzelli Art House. I suppose our connection to this exhibition, this artist, and that sort of story begins a few years ago. We curated an exhibition that was broadly inspired by a book written by Mary Gabriel called 9th Street Women, and that was a group show, included some more familiar names we know like Frankenthaler and Joan Mitchell and Lee Krasner, and also kind of began our interest in a much bigger group of post-war, primarily American at the time, women abstract artists. And we have organised shows by people like Pearl Fine, and we've included works by, I mean, yeah, you name it really, sort of pretty much, yeah, a broad spectrum of those artists. So yeah, when we organised our first exhibition a number of years ago, we kind of realised that there weren't that many galleries in London that seemed to support this kind of canon of artists, and yeah, so we've organised lots of shows similar to Lily's one, I guess.
Well, I'm going to begin with the most obvious question for all of us. What do you all feel, and please give me the breadth of your opinion, makes Lily's work so unique? Let's root this conversation in her as an artist. So, yeah, do you want to begin as the representative of her gallery? What makes her so interesting?
So what interests me really is, as Charles kind of sort of alluded to earlier, was Lily's relationship to the established art world, and the kind of reinvention of non-representational work that she kind of redressed from a incredibly long career. So we've got works in the show from 1950 up until 2010. And what attracted me to Lily's work is this kind of, beginning of new series. And we find in a commercial gallery what can be quite sort of a depressing story is artists who kind of are thinking about the market when they're developing their practice and wanting to kind of adhere to repeating the same kind of work over and over again because that's sort of what the market wants. And you can see, if you've had a chance to look around and look upstairs, Lily's kind of resistance to that idea. She would go back to the studio and kind of re-emerge with a whole new body of work. Although there are connections between these different series. Yeah, there's a sort of rebel kind of vibe about that story that I really like, yeah.
Christian, what were your feelings,
Yeah.
obviously buying an earlier piece?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. When you look at these abstract expressionist artists, and basically abstract expressionism started in New York in the late 1940s and developed out of sort of geometric abstraction that had come out of Europe in the sort of 20s and 30s, Miro and Kandinsky, and then became this sort of expressive, emotional way of more randomly moving paint around the canvas so the person's feelings could come out on the canvas rather than it being more organized. So the bulk of that movement was based in New York with the famous names that we know today like Helen Frankenthaler, Krasner, Mitchell, Pollock, Rothko, Willem de Kooning, etc., Franz Klein, Robert Motherwell. But there wasn't that many painters on the West Coast. Clifford Steele would be the main one. So I think it's kind of interesting to look at her sort of 50s works because She was one of the few female painters on the West Coast at that time, which would have included Deborah Remington and Sonia Geshtoff. Sonia Geshtoff ended up moving to New York. Lilly Fenichel spends a bit of time in New York as well, I think, in the 50s. And and they're classic sort of pictures of the time. But as George says, some of these artists kind of painted consistently throughout their career on a similar theme, like Mitchell never really changed the way too much in the way that she painted, whether it was from sort of the early 50s or kind of looking at the later works, the sort of 70s and 80s. And you would say that Helen Frankenthaler painted a fairly consistent theme throughout her career. But other ones like Fenichel, and you really see it in this show, changed and moved with the times. The paintings that she's doing in the 60s and 70s are really quite different. I mean, they're quite geometric. They're almost leger-like the 60s pictures that you've got upstairs.
Yeah, it's like leger with little moments of almost like Graham Sutherland wiggling in there, drawing-wise.
Exactly. So I think that's kind of interesting about her work as well. You have very distinctive periods in her work, and that's it's a fascinating show from that perspective as well.
What do you feel as a curator in terms of that makes her unusual? Obviously, being used, and particularly having looked at so many female artists.
I think I was really drawn to the 50s works, to these works that we're looking at, and the real gestural abstraction to begin with. And I think she's kind of stands apart even from that group of women artists in the Bay Area or Los Angeles, in that there's a more urgency in her mark making, or there's more, maybe it's what Charles was talking about. You can sense her scowl. I think it's not that they're tighter and there's more tension in them than I think some of the work coming out of California in the 50s, and I was really drawn to that. And then I think as she evolves and changes her series, as Christian and George have spoken about, yes, there's a real progression in how she paints, but there's still something really interesting about the way she treats the surface, that it feels very topographic to me. Even the Leger-like Sutherland works that we were talking about, they're quite diagrammatic, or they're like maps. And that's what I find really fascinating as a kind of thread.
Obviously, if you read a lot about her biography, within things it talks about she originally was from Austria, escaped in the 30s, comes to the States, obviously trains for a period in San Francisco and moves to New York, but is very, very much at the large central 60s, 70s period connected to Los Angeles. We're talking like Wallace Berman, Ferris Gallery, John Altoon, that whole period. What do you think is interesting about art centers and artists working within them from these periods that are not necessarily, they were a little bit off-piste from the main market? Because I think if nothing else, Lilly is throughout her career presenting, where can I work that's not, if as part of the resistance to the art market, also living geographically, not in Paris, London, New York, etc. What do you find interesting about people making work outside of the main centers of art?
There's a really great quote by, Christine and I were trying to remember, it's Jay DeFeo.
It was Jay DeFeo. I thought it was Deborah Remington, but Jay DeFeo, yeah.
Who's another of the California abstract expressionist painters, and she said that it was easier to make work in Los Angeles than New York, and there was no rivalry between men and women because there was no money anyway. And there was no competition for studio space, and there was no competition for gallery exhibitions. There was no competition for collectors because there weren't any of those things. And so she said that I guess the relationship or the network of people that she was working with was a lot more organic and supportive and collaborative rather than being competitive, which I think I can't necessarily extrapolate that onto all sort of out-of-center areas, but maybe that's something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of an interesting time from us, talking about or mentioning the market as you did, because I think the market was quite small during, obviously, you just had the Depression in the 30s, the war in the 40s. It was quite difficult, particularly, I think, on the West Coast as well as in New York, to get hold of good-sized canvases and paints. So the 40s pictures by any of these artists tend to be quite small. And then America goes through this massive boom as they're helping sort of to rebuild Europe, lending money, their banks are lending money, they're selling commodities to Europe, etc., and everything gets bigger, and the art market really explodes in the US in the 1950s. And then when you look at 50s pictures by all these abstract expressionist artists, they turn from pictures which are this size in the 40s to things which are like gigantic. And there's just more money in the system, and the art market and the value of art, the physical value of it in galleries is just exploding. So I think it must have been sort of an interesting time. I think the West Coast would have been a tiny market by comparison. I think it's kind of striking that many of these, what were a fairly niche group of artists on the West Coast, keep gravitating in and out of New York and showing in New York anyway. I mean, mentioning Clifford Still, he was showing with Peggy Guggenheim in the 40s in New York before she closed her gallery and moved to Venice. And then Betty Parsons takes over as the main gallerist. It's interesting that 3 of the major gallerists in New York actually in the 40s and 50s were women rather than
I think that still continues throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s. It's often large female, in particular in New York.
Yeah.
It's a big
so I think it must have been an interesting period for her. I mean, the fact that she was kind of raging against the machine in the art world was just down to, an individual sort of character, and that she wasn't so easy to deal with, apparently. But otherwise, the opportunities in the art market then, during a period which really, the 50s was the essence of abstract expressionism, because then once you get into the 60s, you're getting into pop and minimalism and zero movement in Europe and this kind of stuff, and the whole thing changes. It's essentially a 50s movement. I
mean, it's quite interesting that as part of that resistance, she's continuing to work with abstraction, with a period of the beautiful cloud painting that I have in the mid-70s, but literally continuing throughout the 80s, 90s until her death, in fact, and rethinking that. Like, from my awareness of her, from what my parents told me, I'm aware that she also was politically engaged and left-wing, and also very interested in things like Reichian and psychoanalysis and things like that. And do you feel that there is something about abstraction in particular that provides opportunities, particularly for female artists maybe, from your own awareness, for some kind of radicality in terms of like political expression, that it isn't didactic? Like, is there a political element in this work, or that period of female artists that you've been collecting or curating or selling?
I mean, I definitely think it was one of the things we tried to do with the Whitechapel show was actually reinsert the politics into abstract expressionism. And I'm saying abstract expressionism, but really it's, if you think about it globally, it's Tashism and it's art informel and it's non-objectivity even on the West Coast. But I think as a movement, it grew out of the angst of the Second World War, and it grew, and it was a result of so many immigrants moving to the States because they had to flee Europe, like Lilly, and they took with them that angst, and they also took with them surrealism and geometric abstraction, and the result is this kind of psychoanalytic gestural explosion that is about freedom of expression, and then was used as a counter to Soviet realism and the Cold War, and I mean, this is a rabbit hole, but then the CIA appropriated abstract expressionism and used it as a tool to promote kind of American liberation.
I mean, it's so amazing. You almost feel like they made it up with the idea that the reality that it was all really, it's true.
Yeah. So yes, there's definitely a politics. I think our argument was that it's not just kind of Jackson Pollock in his loft listening to jazz and smoking and getting drunk. There's a real drive to make this work, and it comes out of a very political context.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating period when you have quite a large number of actually Jewish artists operating in New York in the 50s that have fled the war, and even if the families had already been there a generation or two before the war, they would have had family that would have experienced the worst of the war in Europe and been in contact with them. So you had this terrible period in world history in the 30s and 40s. And yet this movement develops out of it, which is expressive, and in many ways abstraction is frivolous is the wrong word, but you know, it's not political like you would expect in a way, like, you know, talking in contemporary terms like a Banksy or something like that, or going back to the 80s, like you know, a Basquiat can be political, or even a Keith Haring, but it's quite light by comparison, you know. So the artists are getting their feelings and emotions out there on the canvas in a more sort of, you know, subtle way, really. Although often, you know, when you look at the male pictures of that period, they are quite dark in palette. I wonder if that sometimes is to do with it.
I mean,
Whereas
if that big Rothko show in Paris totally
Yeah.
emphasized the relationship between psychological darkness and the expression within color.
Yeah. When you look at the female pictures generally of the 50s, they tend to be brighter, lighter, more airy. The females tended to paint, as a generalization, a much lighter color palette than the males. Not that that's a political thing, but maybe that's a gender thing. It's hard to say, but yeah.
I'm going to ask you, George, a question about the market, and actually maybe not just the market, maybe also about the canon. Like in the past decade, we've seen a very overdue recalibration of the position of women in art history. We've seen museums rehang their work, but also very much so something that has been supported and encouraged through private galleries. Like, it's really a case of the role of the private gallery in supporting estates, and that relationship in turn with museums is quite spectacular. And I'm curious for you, like, how you feel that's still impacting on the art world. What are some of the issues that raises? What are some of the difficulties that come out of that? Particularly, there's got to be some issues when you're having an artist with such a breadth of work throughout their career.
Yeah. I mean, I think like it's still an unresolved dichotomy about how we label women artists. I think. I mean, obviously, I'm talking from it's a bloke saying this, but I mean, is it a kind of useful leg up to provide visibility for some artists that have been overlooked? In one regard, that's a positive thing, is it to kind of frame a conversation around overlooked women is really a tool to provide visibility in a very crowded space of different artists. So in one way, you're really just kind of using these labels and strategies to promote an artist who you think is great. On the other hand, as women, is it like kind of patronizing to be a woman artist as well? I mean, I know it's something that lots of women in shows that we've organized would say, well, I'm an artist, you know, I'm a painter. So I think that kind of redressing gender imbalances in like museum collections, for example, is like really important. It's like weird that the Tate collection was, until fairly recently, like 95% men. And so there's a kind of a useful, you know, reason to bring in artists who have previously not been so visible. That wasn't really the question you asked me, was it? I guess it sort of links in, because what we're talking about is a kind of something the market is labeled as a kind of female AbEx thing. Now we just use that language really as a way of providing visibility for great artists who, in a very busy space where we're all vying to kind of promote artists that we represent, is kind of a useful sort of tool, I suppose, and a way of opening up conversations about gender more broadly. Yeah, sorry, what was the
Well,
what
I'm
was
also
the other
just, I
question?
mean, there's so many questions that
Yeah.
have emerged from that. And obviously, you as a curator coming from a institutional background, obviously, is on the flip side of what that is. But do you find that you're having more like opportunity by readdressing this canon? Do you feel that there's an openness to things? How do you feel like, I mean, do you feel, my fear with all these things is it becomes a trend and then it becomes unfashionable.
Sure, yeah.
And, you know, and the same could apply to people of color. I mean, these essentially female artists, because they've been so undervalued, are also cheaper.
Right, right.
And that's a great benefit to many people within. So I'm just curious, how do we address some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point. I mean, I think the art world is historic, well, certainly looking at the 20th century up to now, is very much about trends. People rushing towards one thing, and then that kind of becomes old hat, and then we rush to something else. And I'd be curious to know whether identity was so prevalent in those previous movements. So whereas you might have pop or AbEx or minimalism or something, it feels like now the conversation is more about identity over like content of work maybe. And what are the potential negative impacts of that moving forward? You're right, it's like it could just be that people move on from this conversation. But one of the great things about abstract expressionism, particularly looking at like New York in the late 40s, early 50s, is that first, there's a show called the 9th Street Show in 1951, which is kind of this revered exhibition where it was like a who's who of AbEx artists at the time. Pollock was in it, and you know, it was we always refer back to this 9th Street Show thing. And if you look at images of it, archival images of the show, it's not, you can't tell who's who in terms of gender or identity or anything else. It's about the work, you know, it's about the painting and stuff. And so, yeah, again, I've lost my train of thought a little bit. But
I think that actually is a fair thing, that we need to be focusing not just on gender, but actually on the content of the work.
Yeah, and it's not unusual for those, the trends of content to shift and change, otherwise we wouldn't have cubism, pop art, minimalism, you know, these things kind of, it's not necessarily about trend, but it's about attention onto certain, you know, areas of visual art. So that's not unusual, but I think what is potentially, you know, a big negative is if it becomes about identity, and then people just move on from gender as an issue, I guess, or something. I don't know.
Well, I mean, when you talk about sort of the market or an artist or showing an artist or exhibiting, you know, it's still got to be a great work of art. It's still got to be a great picture. Otherwise, nobody's going to be interested anyway. You can create a story that is, you know, come and go in 5 minutes, but if you, when you're looking at artists that are not undiscovered exactly, they just need sort of, you know, they need people in this day and age reminding of them. But I mean, it's rare that you're rediscover an artist that wasn't already fairly important in their time, you know, showing at major galleries, had a museum show, or in major group shows along other major artists of the period. Because if they didn't, then they're probably not worth reviving.
But you obviously had a decision to largely collect female artists over the past 10 years as well. That was driven by something in terms of the connection between them.
Yeah, I mean, partly it was when because for 20 years, I collected antiquities, old masters, impressionist drawings, all sorts of things. I collected a little bit of modern and contemporary, but not too much. And then I sort of made a conscious decision about 2013 to focus on mostly 20th century. And it quite quickly dawned on me that I could buy the greatest artworks of the 20th century by the greatest female artists of the 20th century for two reasons. One, they were available to the market, and two, they were affordable on my personal budget. That was not the case with trying to find and buy a Jackson Pollock or a Willem de Kooning. You know, first of all, there hasn't been a great Jackson Pollock on the market. I don't think I've ever seen a great Jackson Pollock on the market. And if there was one on the market, it would be $200 million or $300 million. I've never seen a major 50s Willem de Kooning, early, you know, 50s painting on the market, if If there was, it'd be $250 million. And at the time, 10 or 12 years ago, you could buy Great Joe Mitchell for about $4 million. I bought Lee Krasner's most important picture called Prophecy, that's basically been on tour since 1982 and has been in over 50 museum shows. And that was a similar price to that. And one might regard it as one of America's most important female paintings. And I could buy it. It was sitting on a storage floor in Sotheby's in New York for private sale, one November about 6 or 7 years ago. And that would not happen with an early 50s Franz Klein. I quickly realized that I could put together a really important collection, a museum quality collection of female abstract expressionists, which was my initial focus. Now I've collected everything from sort of female impressionism all the way through to contemporary, but it's not really a contemporary collection. It's mostly impressionism through to sort of around the year 2000. And, these artists are available. I mean, you look at Bert Morisot, for example, which anyone that studied art history will know about Bert Morisot. And she was the major female impressionist painter, without moving off topic here. I don't want to do that, but there was 9 impressionist salons in Paris. First one in 1874. She showed in 8 of them alongside Alfred Sisley, Renoir,
Manet.
Manet,
Sorry,
Manet, yeah, Degas, and Monet, and around the sort of the top 7 or 8 impressionists, if you like. And she showed in 8 of those 9 salons, and the only one she missed because she was pregnant with Manet's brother's daughter. And but you can buy a great Bert Morisot for about $3 or $4 million, and a record for her at auction today is only about $4.5 million or something like that. And she's one of the most important painters of that period. So then I thought to myself, okay, so what are the prices of Grace Hartigan, who was the most important female painter in New York in the early 50s, and actually more important than most of the men. She sold a picture to the Whitney not to the Whitney, she sold a picture to MoMA in 1953, and one to the Whitney in 1954. I mean, the only artists that had done that at the time were contemporary of the period were probably Robert Motherwell and Jackson Pollock. And so I thought, okay, well, how much is an early 50s Grace Hartigan? And instead of being 3 million, they were 300,000. And then, you come down to sort of artists like Lilly Fenichel and, the other major sort of female painters of the period. And, they were kind of like, 70 to 100. So I just thought it was a great moment in time to put together a major collection of sort of 40 or 50 incredible pictures that was just not possible by male artists. And like I say, the pictures have to be super high quality pictures. The first thing when you buy a painting is that apart from the fact that you have to like it, is that it's got to be a good example of the artist's work, and it's got to be a great picture. Otherwise, what are you buying? So they had to be great artists of the period, and that's.
I mean, obviously, it's incredible having people be aware of the value of this and support it, and also loan it. And I want to talk about this. Sorry, it's very strange for me doing a talk about female artists with men. Isn't that weird? I'm sitting there going, I've normally done it, and it's all women on my panel, and I'm like, okay, there. But you are men. Thank you for supporting. I want to talk about this for the other female panelists here, from a curatorial standpoint. Obviously, institutionally, everything's transformed as a result of people selling it, people buying it, people loaning it. How has that shifted what you do and the opportunities for curation and scholarship? Because I think that's also what's so great about your collection is obviously you're very, very serious about the scholarship around the work that you're including, which is amazing. But yeah, can you tell me from a curatorial point of view how this is impacting institutions?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, to be totally honest, I remain very conflicted about this, what George was talking about the sort of corrective idea of reinsertion into a canon or pluralizing of canons so that the women artists are there, are present, and having shows that are called women artists or women, it's really difficult, and I don't find it patronizing at all, but I think my concern is that it, and I say this having made one, but my concern is that it runs the risk of just still maintaining the separation. Mm-hmm. And in an ideal world, that show at Whitechapel would have been women and men, and it would have been 200 artists instead of 100. But the shows of male abstract expressionists have happened, and they've happened a lot, and they've very rarely included women, sometimes one, often Grace Hartigan or Helen Frankenthaler or Joan Mitchell. So I think it was important to bring all of these artists into public view. And in terms of scholarship, I think with that show in particular, it was so much about trying to find them. It was, Candy knows, it was a kind of detective hunt of trying to find these women, and embarrassingly, so much of it happened through Googling, literally Googling wife of, daughter of, sister of, female artist taught by, because there are no records. Like Christian said, they showed in their lifetime, they were bought in their lifetime, and then they weren't remembered in art history. There was no scholarship on them. Their shows weren't reviewed, or if they were reviewed negatively, because, I mean, there are so many awful quotes that we found that were like, we would have thought this painting was good if we hadn't found out it was by a woman.
Yeah, that was the quote that Hans Hofmann made about Lee Krasner,
Yeah.
right? He said, "This painting's so good, you wouldn't have known it was done by
A
you'd have thought
woman.
you wouldn't have known it was done by a woman."
Or another one that we learned the artist was a woman in time to check our enthusiasm.
The Amaranth Ehrenhout one was a good one as well. She painted, it's a picture actually in my collection as well. It was in a show of abstract expressionists in American show in Paris in 1962, and it's written up by the Herald Tribune. And Amaranth Ehrenhout, a female abstract expressionist painter, her picture was picked out. It was the journalist John Ashby wrote this raving review about how great this American abstraction show was in Paris in '62, picked out Amaranth Ehrenhaut's picture, published it in the Herald Tribune at the time, said this was the greatest picture of the show, blah, blah, blah. She sees him at a gallery opening in New York 6 months later, goes up to him and says, you know, this is so amazing what you wrote in the Herald Tribune, you know, it's so great what you wrote about the show, you picked out my painting and published it, you know, thank you very much. And he turns around to her and says, where's the effect of Amaranth? He said, I thought you were a man. And if I'd have known you were a woman, I wouldn't have written it. Yeah. I mean, there's endless quotes like that, right? And as well as this kind of, you know, which you see written up quite a bit now, that the major art history books of the late 20th century, which were used in universities and schools and things, didn't contain any female artists.
I mean, to be honest, as a girl who did art history, until the rehang of the Tate, I think if I was younger, when you went to museums, you would not have seen maybe one female artist, you know, Camille Claudel or something, or Bert Morisot, you know, Artemisia was nowhere. And the idea of actually rethinking the canon, but sometimes it's about the quality of the work that's available and within a collection, and it's difficult. I mean, I interviewed Kerry James Marshall once, actually I've interviewed him 4 times, and he very quickly went, well, this is a great show, it's wonderful, I think it was about, but does it have to be just black artists for those obvious reasons? Can you think of examples of either exhibitions or rediscovered careers or positions where you feel like that ghettoization of identity isn't happening? Are there other ways forward that all of us within our positions can support to shift things, do you feel?
I mean, I sort of think it's a dual approach, which is why I remain conflicted. But I think the shows like the Whitechapel show have to happen just to bring people into, like I said, into public view. And then at the same time, the solo shows and the group shows that are, I guess, more thematic or have a different objective that can just include a more diverse body of artists without speaking to their ethnicity or their gender or their sexuality or all of the other things that we talk about now. I think the two things have to happen at the same time. On the quality, I and just it's a link, is that I think it's our jobs as curators that we talk about the quality of work and not about an artist's identity, that we look at the content of the work and speak about that in our interpretation and our labels and our press releases, rather than the identity of the maker, unless that is the content.
Yeah, I mean, in my museum, so I have a museum of only artworks by female artists in France, from Impressionism through to contemporary. And when I get asked questions about it, I always say, look, we're not trying to make some kind of gender statement here or social statement. I have absolutely no interest in getting involved in that conversation at all. Quite simply, I was able to build a collection and continue to build it of amazing works of art by female artists in a way that just wouldn't have been possible by the men. And you can come to the 99.9% of the people that have visited Mougins since June when we opened it have walked away and said, you know, this is absolutely incredible. We had no idea, you know, that so many great female artists the last 150 years existed. And it's refreshing to go to a museum that's full of artworks by women, as opposed to most other museums, which are full of artworks by men. You can go to virtually any museum in the world, and 90%, 95% of the artworks on their walls will be by, you know, male artists, although maybe not Tate today or whatever, you know, some of the more contemporary museums. But, you know, it's not difficult to walk into a museum full of male artists. It's almost impossible to walk into a museum full of female artists. There's only two in the world. There's one in Washington and there's my one in Mougins in France. So, you know, it really doesn't matter the fact that it's all female. It's not making a gender statement. It gives people the opportunity to walk in and see a museum of female arts, and that's all it's really doing.
George, what are your thoughts in terms of what we can do?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean, I think we're just echoing what we've all talked about before, really. I think there is a consensus. We kind of, one thing I talk about often is like there's no consensus in art, but there is consensus within movements of art, consensus about quality of the work. Like it is there. I mean, you know, we've all spent our lives looking at art, reading about it, writing about it, you know, showing it. And yeah, I think that as long as I don't know, I guess as long as people are really, when putting shows together, are thinking about the quality of the work, they can tell different stories using components of like great artworks. I go back to another thing we were talking about a little bit about the market and your difficulty with scholarship around artists putting the show together. One of the things that like a kind of market does is it brings a big audience to different artists, and it's not just about buying things and owning them. It's an ecosystem, isn't it, of scholarship and curatorial things. It's all blends in. There's lots of examples where an artist might have a really fantastic market, but is widely considered to be not very good art. And so there's like, I don't know, there's sort of that. I just sort of, yeah, throw that in there as
Jack
well.
Vetriano's
There you
very
go,
happy.
Vetriano. Yeah, but he's having a great time, you know.
You know,
I'm sure
he
he's
doesn't
very
care.
happy.
He makes a lot of chocolate boxes.
Yeah, you know, and there's very rich artists who will probably never have shows at the Tate, for example, but they've done well in their career and they've made money and all the rest of it. Yeah. So I think, I don't know.
I think there's also another thing that, like, I'm very aware when we go to museum shows, there's, sorry, I just butt in. So many times we're used to being sold certain narratives of art history. The crazy genius living alone in an attic, the Van Gogh story, for example, the rags to riches story, the old lady who gets discovered when she's dead, or nearly dead, or like on her last legs, Grandma Moses. Like, I think that we're still reliving a lot of art historical tropes that are immensely old fashioned. And I actually think that all of us, perhaps in our own different ways, need to. And I think that's also about, maybe it's also audiences who aren't going, oh, great, that lives into the story I've always wanted to hear. And then he died. Do you know what I mean? There's like, everyone likes the drug overdose and death story, but oh, he was so great if only he'd lived a little longer, for example. And there's actually many living artists who are incredible. We're seeing, I mean, I just think we need to really, really work on rethinking the cliches of art.
And it's sort of interesting because, you know, when working in a gallery, a lot of what I do on a kind of a daily basis really is telling stories. It's telling stories about what the, you know, what's hanging on the walls, and people are curious about who made the work. And you're absolutely right. There are these kind of well-worn, not that I would ever talk about in such cliches, obviously, but there are certain stories that appeal to people. You know, the young troubled genius that died too young, and this sort of stuff. And the question is like, do we need to be? Do we start telling different stories, or are those stories appealing to people for some other reason outside of a gallery context?
I mean, I think it's really interesting, but I think also we all have it. Like, for example, within Lily's work, Lilly was an incredibly stylish, successful person living in the middle of Hollywood, knew everyone in Hollywood, was working on the side as a stylist in commercials, which I'm sure she wouldn't necessarily want to have said, and on films, and actually was very, very connected and had a really varied career outside of the stories you normally hear about an abstract expressionist. And for me, as an audience, I find that really interesting. Like, I want to know, I mean, when I curated Manifesta, I did a whole entire room devoted on people who had second jobs. Like, I like to know where everyone was teaching, who they're hanging out with, all those kind of things. And I think actually, if we resist in our roles fulfilling the cliches, then the audience is interested too. But maybe the audience also should be searching for things beyond the cliche. But I think it happens in mainstream institutions a lot. You know.
Yeah, I agree. I think I was going to say a similar thing about Lily, is that actually maybe that's partly why she's so fascinating. She doesn't fit into one of those cliches that, and George, you told us last week that every time somebody asked her to make more work because it sold really well, she was like, "Fuck you! I'm going to make something totally different," which. And partly that maybe that's why we're only talking about her now after she's died, and we weren't, and she wasn't spoken about more while she was alive. But
yeah, I mean, that is a story that people tend to kind of engage with Lily in particular, you know, because a resistance to the market in the art world is actually quite kind of unusual. We've become so used to the commercialization of absolutely everything in our lives, and more in the art world more than anywhere else, I guess, or it's the same as anywhere else. And this sort of idea that you can be a successful artist in your own way and have a long career. I mean, the works that she made in like 2010, she was in her 80s at this point, and she's experimenting with painting on plastic and mixing paints and like this new technique. And she sort of began this whole new body of work that's got great energy to it and experimental, and unlike the previous series that she'd worked in. And, you know, that's a story that people can understand and get behind as well, because it's, it's
well,
you
also
can
it's
connect
really
with it.
we're also taught within commodity culture to chase the new. So it's actually really interesting of how can we rethink the existing, and that actually newness is not always better. Shall I open it up to a question? Are there any questions within our audience? I will bring over the microphone.
Well, thank you for such a candid, objective discussion. It's quite refreshing in these times of My question is related to that, in that freedom of expression of artists and freedom to see art seems to be under some kind of threat, where people get offended if they don't like the content, and public institutions are removing works because of this offence. I just wonder whether you have any comment on that kind of phenomenon that seems to be about more than it used to be. Yeah. Well, I think it's a censorship, like, the content of a historical painting will defend on gender or race grounds, and people insisting that it shouldn't be shown, kind of thing.
I guess I think that it goes both ways, or it goes all ways. And I think, what do I think? I think that so much contemporary work also other audiences find difficult or offensive in different ways. And so I think as institutions, we just have a responsibility to be true to the artist. I guess I would always return to the artist if they're alive, and I would never want to censor an artist. An institution often has to censor itself, but I would never want to censor an artist or their expression. I guess if a work is genuinely offensive to a certain group of people, then there is probably a conversation to be had around whether it should be removed. But without speaking too much about specifics, I guess, I don't know, I can't say more than that.
I mean, Otto Mule, Eric Gill, they're going to have problems with their careers.
Yes.
Being, an abusive person has issues. Being a fascist is it like Kanye West. If he never shows anywhere again, I would be very happy.
But then I guess the flip side, and maybe I'm being too candid, is my husband edits Tate's magazine, and they've had more complaints this issue over Lee Bowery than they've had in the last five years. How
amazing that Lee Bowery's still pissing people off.
But the fascinating thing is that they're like, if this is what you call contemporary art, then I'm out. But it's not contemporary. It's 30 years ago.
He died in 1994.
So I think there are many people that can be offended all the time, and that is the tightrope that we have to walk.
I'd also argue that the really offensive work really you look at Vienna Actionists and things happening in the 60s, they were the ones who were really doing things that were transgressive. The 60s were much more transgressive than now. Now we're much more reactive. But that's just, wow. Lee Bowery pissing people off.
I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I can't speak much about kind of censorship, but what I can say is that people hate art. There's always been that relationship, an antagonistic relationship between different groups having a strong feeling about an artwork. And that's great. That's wonderful. If we all agreed that there was this one artwork that was brilliant, then it wouldn't be a very realistic version of reality. And the art world is sort of like, I don't know, it's sort of drenched in opinion about an artwork, and I don't know. Yeah.
Any other questions? Anything Fenichelish? Abstraction? Yes.
Can I ask a very specific question about her works? Did she give names or titles to her pictures? And if she didn't, did she leave writing or clues about them, or did she expect the works to speak entirely for themselves?
Good question. So the titles were important to Lilly, and there's actually a great interview. Talk about scholarship, by the way, is trying to find interviews with Lilly online and things like that. It's quite hard. But anyway, you can find interviews with her out there. And she does talk about titles of her work. Her uncle was a quite prominent psychoanalyst, and sort of there's in an interview that was in the 80s, she talks about this shift from Freudian analysis into Wilhelm Reich, and this kind of shift from a kind of a worldview, I guess, and the sort of consolation of that sort of analytical way of thinking. And anyway, I'm babbling on. But anyway, yes, the titles were important to answer your question. In terms of like writing about her work and trying to find things that she's talks about her work, it's like, yeah, it's quite, it's hard, but you can.
But that would
find
also,
stuff.
I'd argue, be something that was from 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Like in terms of like the archiving of printed material and interviews, it's very difficult out there. There really isn't, it's keep your printed things, share your printed, donate your printed things.
Digitize your printed.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm a fan of the word on paper.
Well, I'm just going to add, we talked kind of a little bit about her personality and about her maybe being a bit of a curmudgeon, et cetera, but really she was an amazing person. And she was loved by the art community. And people like Sam Francis and Robert Irwin, Larry Bell, I mean, they just loved her, looked up to her. She rebelled a lot against male chauvinistic behavior at the Ferris Gallery in West Coast. So that was part of her rebellious nature. But she was a great listener. She was a wonderful person. She knew all about music, fashion, the arts, had a lot to say. So there was a whole nother side to her as well. That
My mum said she's a really good cook.
yeah, a wonderful cook. So really, there's a lot of personality to explore there, and maybe we should look at more of her personality too.
You know, it's really interesting. When I was asked to do this and I was thinking about it, it made me realize, you know, as a journalist and curator, how often we create these narratives around an artist that don't incorporate what you know about a person. And actually, there's like your public art self and then the actual person that you're hanging out with. And I think that's a really fascinating thing in terms of how, and like an artistic heritage is left. And I think it's really important. It's made me rethink how I talk about and write and curate artists.
100%. I mean, there's so many layers. I mean, she loved jazz, and when she was teaching at Chenard in San Francisco, the whole scene there was listening to trad jazz. The Grateful Dead was listening to trad jazz, Dixieland jazz. She went up there and taught them Miles Davis and Coltrane. You know, there's just like all this stuff going on that is really fascinating and is layers and layers of things about it. It's interesting. She was friends with Warhol. You know.
Well, and I actually think another question that I wanted to bring up is, what can we learn from these kind of pioneering women, let's put it that way, or pioneering artists, so that for a younger artist to learn from? Like, what do we know about the living artists now? How can we prevent, let's say, the misalignment of reputation, or create ways of preserving and expressing the breadth of what people are? I think is really interesting, and I think that's also something that even just showing artists like this is present.
I'll throw one more out there. Did you know she was the influence behind Sports Illustrated swimsuits?
No.
Yeah. She was best friends with Rudy Gerner, the guy who invented the bikini, and she proposed the idea to Sports Illustrated. So there's loads of stuff, right? Go figure. So we talk about the art world, but there's the person, I guess, is the point as well. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, over here.
Can I ask you, Christian, you said there are only 2 museums in the world which are just female artists. So one, how have the public reacted to your museum? And 2, should there be more?
Well, it depends who you ask. On the whole, people think that there definitely should be more. I think there are extremists out there that would say that we're not helping the gender discussion and making it more even by it's more of a segregation to just show female artists, not balance them against men. But as I said earlier, you can walk into hundreds of museums around the world that are all male artists. This gives you an alternative to that. Take it or leave it, basically. The response, other than maybe by 1 or 2 just odd people, but by thousands and thousands of others have been tremendously positive. And something that's been really amazing is that we've been covered now on 7 occasions since we opened in June on French TV. We made the 9 o'clock news on one of the 3 major French channels the night before we opened, and we hadn't called them. We've been on sort of the breakfast show on TFR, and it's just been consistent. And last summer we were also featured in French Vogue, French Marie Claire, and French Harper's. So it's transcended, the art newspaper, Apollo magazine, and gone into sort of wider women's magazines and women's issues. And that hasn't been created by us. It's just done that by itself. So that's been tremendously exciting and overwhelming in a way that we just hadn't really expected in a positive way. So when all these specialist sort of women's magazines are embracing it, that would appear to be an incredibly positive accolade. And so visitor numbers are up, because actually before it was a classical art museum. So for 12 years before that, it was the Mougins Museum of Classical Art, which had my Roman, Greek, and Egyptian antiquity collection in it, interspersed with artworks from the 16th century through to the modern period that had classical themes, so you could see the ancient world versus the modern. And then I closed it and then did a refurbishment and reopened it as FAM, the Female Art Museum, last June. So we get negative comments sometimes on Google from people that preferred the Classical Art Museum to the Museum of Female Art. You know, it is what it is. But I'm showing a different collection these days, and but overwhelmingly the response has been tremendously positive, and it's just a great haven for people to come and learn about women arts and be surrounded by it in a sort of immersive sort of situation, and people who seem to be really enjoying that and getting educated by it as well. I'm publishing another 2 books this year, another book on female artists from Impressionism through to contemporary, so it's not quite as focused as the abstract expressionist one. Publishing another book this year on 100 artists, female artists, the last 150 years, called In Their Own Words, where we've taken, we've gone through literally hundreds, if not thousands, of books and letters and sort of videos and things that exist to find different quotes by different female artists where they're talking about their work, what they're thinking when they're painting, about their methodology. And we put that into a book, because actually when you research artists like Mary Cassatt, Bert Morisot, Jeanne Hébuterne, it's quite difficult to find quotes by them. Sometimes you've got to go through 4 or 5 books to find a quote. It's amazing how many art history books have been written about an artist, and none of the words of the artist are in the book. It's absolutely astounding how often that happens. You would think it would be a semi-interview with the artist, and so often it isn't. It's just, it's a, it's an academic that's got a lot of information together about that artist and written a book about them without really necessarily getting into the head of the artists themselves and finding out or interviewing family members, etc. at the time, and going, and finding out what they were thinking when they actually painted their pictures. So we've tried to do that. And I mean, the book over there has already sold out twice on Amazon in 2 years. And JP Morgan bought 2,500 copies of it the summer before last and gave it to all their private clients and put it on their summer reading list. So half the print run went in one, the first print run went in one order. So yeah, I think people are really embracing also having an opportunity to read more broadly about female artists. I mean, there's hundreds of books out there about specific artists, You can buy 20 books on Leonore Finney, 5 or 8 books on Dorothea Tanning, 6 or 7 books about Joan Mitchell now. But the more broad books, talking about female movement sort of, are quite actually thin on the ground. And when we were talking earlier about women artists being written out of the generalist art history books in the late 20th century, there's one particular book that sticks in my mind with regard to that. And there was a book written in 1970 called The Triumph of American Painting by an art critic called Irving Sandler. And The Triumph of American Painting is about the abstract expressionist period. So it's written in 1970. The abstract expressionist period is essentially 50s, to some degree, 60s movement. He knew all of the artists, including the women artists of the period, and was friends with a lot of the women artists of the period. And yet in that book, he doesn't mention one of the female artists, not one of them. And there must be 200 plates of pictures in that book. I mean, how can you write a book about a movement that's just happened? You're friends with both genders, and you just miss one of the two genders out. It's, you know, it's unbelievable. Yeah. So to answer your question, the museum's been really well received by 99.9% of people. Is the short answer to the question. Yeah.
Shall we have a last question? One there.
Thank you. I remember visiting the show when it opened, and I was upstairs and I was asking somebody, who was that picture by? And I didn't realize it was all the same artist. And you touched on that earlier, that such a range of work, which seems to me pretty unusual. I don't know if you had any insights or through your research, what caused Lilly to, I mean, the work with the oil on polyester, you know, it was really quite groundbreaking and experimental in an unusual way that I can see.
I can't think of many artists today that actually take the risk, or I'm going to rephrase that, can afford to take the risk to do this breadth of stylistic approach to what they're doing. You know, the cloud stuff that I have is completely different to every single painting in this. Susan Hill was great like that, but she still had an ongoing, like, in terms of medium, there would still be a connection between her work. It would still not. People have periods. Yeah, but later. But like in terms of this, like if you look at a painter, most painters pick their style and stick. Maybe they have different sections of period. Picasso, he had some good ones. He could do a bit of variety. There you go. But also maybe that's also something that I think that comes out of financial freedom, actually, from having to sell your stuff on the market. Or so maybe it comes out of the refusal.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Well,
it's.
just age. The older you get, the less you care.
Yeah.
Well, the longer you're alive to create more.
Yeah, but they still make the same thing again and again.
Yeah. I've got this, maybe it's a bit of a mythological way of thinking about Lilly's different sort of series, but for me it was more of a kind of an active like antagonism to a market, sort of being told what to paint was the thing that pushed her into a different direction. But you know, I never met Lilly. I don't know if that story is true or not, but I mean that's sort of a component of when we talk about all these different series. It's about sort of tells us something about a character, and yeah, I think that's I don't know.
I think she was a big believer in not making hemline art.
There you go. Yeah.
She didn't go with fashion. And when she was done, when she had all the input, all the satisfaction, she'd explored a particular style, she was done. And she would say that was, that she'd finished that period, she was waiting for the next thing. And there'd be an enormous amount of angst as she tried to find the next big thing. In her life, and then she would do that until it was done. And as you say, she resisted the temptation just to do the stuff that people wanted to see. And if something was going well, that would be the beginning of at the end of that because she'd kind of done it and got it, and time to move on.
Yeah. Not to talk about different artists, but we've done a couple of shows with one of Lilly's sort of adjacent contemporaries, Pearl Fine, and we organised a retrospective of her work about, I don't know, a year or two ago, and it similarly, she from decade to decade kind of worked in different sort of styles of non-representational art as well. So that's another one I can just sort of think of as an example, but not to divert from the Lilly conversation too much.
Should we say thank you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much for sitting and talking, hearing us talk.
Thank you for
Thank you.
moderating so well.